Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC Streams session, bringing government and people closer, practical tips to make it happen. We have on today's panel M. Ramachandran, former Secretary Government of India, Uma Mahadevan, Principal Secretary, Rural Development and Panchayat Raj Government of Karnataka, Srinivas Alavilli, Head Civic Participation Janagraha, and Meera K, co-founder Citizen Matters. And this panel will discuss the multiple prescriptions to a development practitioner, the myriad common problems that people face in both urban and rural areas, among other governing challenges that M. Ramachandran's book of the same name as this session is titled addresses. The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions, observations, or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A box next to the chat box, also at the bottom of your screen, to share them with us. And with that, over to Meera.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session on bringing governments and citizens closer. If you ask an average person out in the street and what do they think of their experience going to a government office and getting some work done, in all likelihood, you would not get a great, feedback. They would often you would find them saying, oh, it was sort of uncomfortable. And in general, even personally for me, in the beginning, when I used to go to government offices to get something done, it was this, you get the sense of being in a principal's office, right? It's like discomfort, and there is this perception of as though they are doing you a favor. And that's sort of typical. An average person doesn't have much of experience dealing with government officials, except for that interaction, that interface of getting something done. But broadly, over time, as I've interacted more and more with officials and different government functionaries and elected reps, you kind of understand the challenges that they face, and they're coming from a very hard point. It's not easy to get things done. There are systemic issues, and even when individuals try their best, they succeed at times, and at times it's kind of, the system weighs them down. So to understand that is very important if we want to have this shared goal of making a change in our society. So over the years, you've kind of seen that people have kept away from dealing with government, right? And it's very common to see the role of intermediaries. You have agents, and to get things done, whether it is getting a driver's license or getting your birth certificate, it's pretty common. And this concept of retail corruption was, a very understood one, right? You expect to pay something to get something done. And a lot of it is also because of this information asymmetry, right? An average person doesn't know how things work, what are the rules, what is the process. And even when there is a website or when there is a board in the government office saying you need to do this 1 2 3 4, and yet there are like nuances in that you don't realize. You fill a form and you go back, and then they'll say, oh, you need this affidavit. You get a doctor's certificate and go back and say, oh, it has to be a government doctor, right? So a lot of it is not really documented in detail, and there are things that are known only to the officials in charge. So that information asymmetry is also one of the reason why you have all these disconnect and this discomfort, as well as this corruption that we're talking about. So in the early days of Citizen Matters, we got a lot of stories. We started getting experiences shared by citizens and how they got things done, and often without having to pay a bribe, because they learned it the hard way, right? How do I get a LL, for example, was written by an 18-year-old the first time, and that process were very, very elaborate and very informative. It was not something that was documented anywhere. And then we saw, after publishing that, we saw so many more people following those procedures to actually get things done in their own way. So we realized these kind of explainers and guides and FAQs were hugely empowering to people. And over the years, we've kind of even published books with getting things done, living in Bengaluru, and so on. So this sort of information, I think, has been very valuable, and that's one of the key things Mr. Ramchandran raises in his book. And also over the years, this whole digitalization has helped. You don't need to necessarily have so much of a interaction. You don't have to go there, wait in a long queue. There's a lot of things you can get it done online very easily. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I had to renew my driver's license. It was very, very simple. It was documented and so on. And also, more importantly, in the last 10-15 years, especially in Bangalore, you see another kind of relationship between government and citizens. These are what I would call partnerships or collaborations, and there's a shared goal, right? You're trying to save a lake, you're trying to fix a road, and these are sort of public good. This is not something personally. It's not like I want a an approval to build a house. It is not something that I want for myself, right? I don't want a death certificate for somebody in my family, so on. So this to work with the government in for a in a shared project, in a common project, has been very, very interesting. And these experiences, and there have been many civic groups around, in and around Bangalore especially, who have had great experiences, and Srini can come more on that, on how they got things done and how they've been able to make a difference. So, and this has also led to a sort of a difference in the equations, right? And it kind of shows that change can happen. It is possible to work together. And this the way this relationship has evolved, it's sort of like dealing with peers or equals, right? We're kind of walking along the same path of making a better neighborhood or a better city, while systemic issues still remain, right? There is still corruption, there's lack of capacity or bandwidth, but there is this recognition of the fact that change cannot happen without working together. And that, I think, has been the key learning from what I have observed in the last 10-15 years, in especially in Bangalore. And with this context, I invite Mr. Ramchandran to share his opening remarks. In the next 10 minutes, he will be summarizing the key takeaways from his book, and we will use that as a context for the conversation going forward. Over to Mr. Ramchandran.
Thank you, Meera. My other co-panelists, Uma, Srinivas, and Lekha from BIC. I start by thanking Mr. Ravichander of BIC for organizing this book discussion. It's always interesting, and I always start by saying the Vice President of India who released my book, he says, books should lead to generation of ideas, and ideas should get discussed. So I'm glad sitting in Delhi, I wrote the book. Currently, I'm sitting in Mumbai, but the book is generating discussion amongst a cross-section of people in different cities. And as Meera rightly summed up, the city characteristics also vary. In some cities, things work in a better manner. In some places, I would say some places, whether cities or villages, it works differently. So this book, I call it Bringing Governments and People Closer, is essentially about the problems we all as commoners face in dealing with government offices and getting what is due to us in the form of documents, certificates, clearances, benefits of schemes, and the like. Moving on, what I have done is to put together my understanding of the issues involved in ensuring hassle-free governance. And I've used this word quite often, hassle-free, because as Meera rightly mentioned, things have changed. But again, the hassles are still there or not, that is the question. And delivery at the ground level. I've made a distinction between the privileges some of us may be enjoying while dealing with government systems, and that of the common man. Over a period, there have been changes and improvements. Technology has helped a lot, and times have changed. While in service, we have seen days when villagers who have a title to land found it very difficult to get a copy of the record of rights or to get a property registered at the office of the sub-registrar. Today, one can access the title document, but getting a property registered, particularly in a mega city, could still be full of hassles. And in my book, I have referred to an instance in Bengaluru itself, because registration is still a complicated area. The India Corruption Survey of 2019 found most bribes paid are for property registration, And that topped the list of areas where one had to pay bribes. And the UN, sorry, the UN Government Index places India at the level of 96 among a total of 193 countries. I've discussed various such instances and tried to flag where the problem lies, whether it is getting something done from, as mentioned, from the office of the regional transport officer or the police department. Why is it that an ordinary man rarely finds it a comfortable and hassle-free experience? One of the main reasons why people get harassed while trying to get something done through the government system is that quite often the process is cumbersome and a time-taking one. We all agree that one of the fundamental transformations required in the governance system, more so at the lower levels or levels close to the day-to-day requirements of people, is that of transparency coupled with simplicity of procedures. These two words, I think, become very key to the entire discussion. Services available on a time-bound basis, which should be hassle-free. Information should be available on time. And I've referred to 3 instances of lethargy, despite all that is being said, that of the experience of dealing with the post office, dealing with a bank, and the Life Insurance Corporation of India. People may laugh at that, but I have myself experienced going and standing in a line, and when your turn comes, or after some time, the person sitting on the other side says, server is down, I can't do anything. And then they continue with their cup of tea. One doesn't know when the server will be back to action. So there are 3 instances. The response to that could be, why don't you do it online? But then is it possible for every person to do it online, especially those who are not that literate? That is the question. Moving on to public service delivery, I accept that there have been lots of improvements. This concept emerged globally in the 1990s with what is called the new public management and citizen charters, which evolved in the UK and various other countries picked up. So the new public management became a concept which was accepted and emphasized on adopting what and why from public administration, how from private administration. It was a mix of the two. And it was reinforced by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at that time. There was a shift in the role of the state from being producer and distributor of public services to facilitator and regulator. That's the change which came about. If we recall, Prime Minister Gujral in 1997 had convened a meeting of Conference of Chief Ministers and prepared an action plan for effective and responsive administration. And that is where the citizen charters became a little popular in our country. And something like 120 charters came up with the central government, 729 charters in the state departments. There is a study of the Indian Institute of Public Administration done in 2007, which said that the citizen charters have become outdated. The e-governance process started in our country in the 1990s and Digital India in 2014. Then came about this Right to Information Act, My Government, Citizen Engagement Platform, CP, GRAMS, RIS, and things like that. So there are changes which have happened, but whether those changes still make any sense to a person who is in a far-off village or living in a backward area of a city or a town, that is the question. Why is it that even with all the efforts being made to make governance simple and transparent, and I have referred to minimum government, maximum governance norm and all that, India's score on the Corruption Perception Index of 2020 also is below the global average. It's being highlighted that it is petty corruption that hurts the common people more. And a former World Bank president has said that it eats away at governance and moral fiber and destroys the trust. Now, there could be a question to people like us, what have you done? So there are many individuals in the system who try to bring about changes, but systems have to be formalized in the scheme of things. And that is where I would make a distinction between, someone asked a question in one of my earlier discussions, what is the role for political executive? Political executive, of course, lays down policy, brings in legislation, gets it passed through the legislature, and he is competent also to approve, if there is delegated legislation, the rules which follow. But procedures get drafted and they also, in a way, in each ministry, it gets approved by the minister. So political executive's role is there. It is the administrative executive who has to make sure that what is meant to be provided is provided in the right manner without hassles. And that is the key question which gets addressed here. We are all part of a system and one is to function within the four corners of the system. After listing some of the common problems which people face either in the urban areas or rural areas of India and trying to honestly list people's expectations, I have focused on how complicated procedures make life difficult and where all changes are needed. Then I've listed out in detail what are the much needed governance changes. Now, how clarity and transparency need to be built in more proactively and suggested an agenda for action by the year 2022. That is, we are going to celebrate 75 years of our independence. So I suppose there is every reason that delivering governance in a hassle-free manner to each and every person who is entitled to it. That could be the theme and that could be taken up as a mission, only then it's really going to work. So, and I've made some suggestions like we could have outside the system, because within the government system, when we assess, we try to give an impression that everything is working fine. But it need not always be so. It's always good to have inputs. People talk about citizen participation and things like that. So society wardens to guide people who need help. That is something which I think we can do from amongst our society. Use the expertise of nationally reputed organizations like the Indian Institute of Public Administration, who do lots of studies and elevate their stature that they constantly oversee the governance issues and come back to government with what needs to be changed. True friends and guides for the government and people from amongst the civil society people, they could be there to help people. And I narrated a small instance. Ayushman Bharat is supposed to help poor people, but one came across an instance of a maid working in one of the houses. She met with a serious accident. She had to be admitted. An operation had to be taken up, but she did not get any of the benefit because she was not registered under Ayushman Bharat. Why? Because she lives in a slum and her address proof could not be provided. So there are issues like that which need to be sorted out. That's where I think the society wardens or guides amongst the people who have experience, who are committed to the cause, can make a big difference in facilitating people like that having access to what is supposed to be provided. So as I said, when we are celebrating 75 years of independence, there cannot be a more significant achievement than being able to ensure that any person who has anything to get from the government, be it a service or an entitlement or a benefit, can get it in laid down time without any hassle. Then I have given a 10-point agenda which can be taken up. I won't repeat that because I may be more or less reaching the end of my time. So there are actions which can be done, and the center and the states have to work together. And one or two general points. I use the word governments. When I say governments, it is the central government, the state governments, the local governments. And if you recall, local governments came into existence as an answer to this particular issue that governance should be taken to the lowest level possible. And it's another matter that whether they have all the functions, they have all authorization to work or not, but that came about. The other caveat I would like to mention here is, as I mentioned, the role of the political executive and the administrative executive. One has to have a distinction. And issues like transparency, accountability. I still believe that if a person who has to issue a birth certificate or who has to issue a driving license or who has to do a registration, if that is clearly known, procedure is clearly known, as Meera rightly outlined in the beginning, and for those who cannot really follow technicalities, even with people like us, this could happen because, as you rightly said, we go with all the, we think we have all the documents, but then they say this is not required, that is required. And I've referred to offices like that of the sub-registrar, which gives good revenue to the government. But you go to some of the sub-registrar's offices, there is no place to stand outside. And why can't officials visit such offices, interact with people, come back and bring about changes? Why can't investment be made in proper waiting areas, a proper token system and things like that? Why should brokers be functioning in the transport offices? There are issues like that. So if you have to get over all these obstacles, which are still there despite all the technological improvements which have come about, which have made life easy, but still that last part which remains, I think for that you have to make a real effort to bring about changes. I think I'll stop at this stage and hand it back to Meera.
Thank you, sir. That was very enlightening. And I'm going to start with like the fundamental question, the fundamental issue that when we talk about this whole government citizen engagement, which is the trust deficit, right? And it works on both sides. It is valid on both sides. You, on one hand, you will see governments not sharing information, and on the other side you will see citizens also not sharing rules, following rules. Now there is a major conflict here, and this is something especially, and Srini and I volunteered last year with this, when there is lockdown and the migrant crisis, this lack of information sharing. For example, from the government side, there were like orders and without much of explanation, right? And if you compare something like, for example, during the similar situation in Germany, you had the officials and the elected reps coming out and explaining what is going on. Whereas in this case, a lot of times, like the average folk didn't, maybe some of us who are following like media diligently may track it, but a lot of people on the ground had no clue what's going on. They were just like, they saw everything was locked down, nothing was available, and they just wanted to go home, right? So that was a huge like a crisis, and that could have been avoided with much better sort of communication, information sharing. And why do we get into this situation? This is something like endemic. It is not something new, but it happens and again. How do we build trust between the two sort of stakeholders? And I invite all the panelists to talk about. Mr. Ramchandran, would you want to come in first?
Uh, I think it's a question of trying to bring about changes, the mindset part of it. See, having been part of government, quite often what a government official thinks is, I should go according to what is laid down and I should not go out of the way. So in my book, I've talked about where discretion is permitted. And the norms for permitting discretion should be stated so that he is not hauled up later. So it is possible. And there could be some situations where some sort of discretion is required despite all the instructions and guidelines given. And if he or she exercises it, it is recorded, this is why I did this, and this is in the interest of the person. That's one way of addressing it. Then the mindset change, it depends on very many factors, as you would have noticed. It also includes the training given to these people, that when some scheme is drawn up and something is newly introduced, how is that to be handled? What is the consideration which you can give? That is where I refer to, I mean, it's many, many years old. When I went to a district, I thought all the pradhans should know about the development schemes, which are always the privy of the government official only. What entitles you to take advantage of the scheme and benefit. Today, it's much, much more open. It is accessible. Then, as you rightly said, it's a question of explaining it to the people. So, depending solely on the government system, I don't think this change is going to come about, though there are very many people within the system who would like to work in a proactive manner. But beyond that, I think it is the trust of the society, and those people who have to be involved have to have, a clean reputation, and such people should be brought in to guide. And if they point out a shortcoming or a problem to an official, it should immediately be addressed, because it comes from a person who has the strength of moral character, who has experience, who has interacted with people. So changes should be possible. But in the system, sometimes once guidelines, procedures are introduced, for the change to happen, it has to go back upwards. So again, the government has to come up with schemes whereby what modifications can be made at what level. A senior level at the district probably could approve such changes which need to be brought about if that is what is required. It should be possible, it should be open, it should be transparent, it should be available on the domain, and it should go back to the senior functionary who would have issued the original instructions. That is required. So it's a combination of factors like this which can bring about a change. And as you rightly said, if you are getting a driving license today, if that is easier today, things have changed to that extent. But we are talking about that segment which still needs to be addressed. And probably there should be lessons from how that has happened. And those lessons could be brought in here. And I've also referred to an example. You go to a bank branch, and when the behavior is rude and the person is not helpful, I said, what is the type of training given to that person that should be made known to the public, that he or she has been advised, guided to behave like this, like this, like this, in such circumstances. If he or she cannot do it, go to the superior, get a decision made, and convey to the person concerned. So there are methods of doing it rather than just saying that I cannot do it. You have to come back another day and things like that. So the mindset would make a big difference. Training would make a big difference. and also the interactive process would make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Uma, do you want to comment, especially from the experience in the last year and a half? I know it's been a huge challenge on all fronts. Wouldn't have been easy, but still, how could we have done better?
Yes, it's a great question, Meera, and you've really hit the nail on the head. This trust deficit, governments, uh, this is an area where the government system is inexperienced in communicating because until recent years, um, it, information has always been power. It has been something to be privileged and not shared easily, which is why you have middlemen and touts and so on who can translate the ways of seemingly complicated government systems for the unsuspecting public, but also the fact that within government itself, decisions, there is a trust deficit. Somebody is always passing the buck upwards, or the buck goes downwards, in the sense that there's always this sense that I can take a decision only if so many people write in the file that this is okay. So that trust deficit is endemic. It's inside government, and it's a very big mindset problem, as Mr. Ramchandran pointed out. The other thing is that in communicating, governments are still learning. They are on the far end at the beginning of the learning curve. Last year, we were taken aback by the pandemic, like governments everywhere. And my group, Srinivas, worked very closely with us. Many of you worked very closely with us. My group was actually helped by many organizations, civil society organizations and NGOs, which helped to partner with us in playing this role of translating government instructions, orders, SOPs, guidelines as they came, not only literally translating them into different kinds of languages, because remember, we were dealing with migrant crisis, we were translating into Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, different languages, Hindi, and I remember we were translating things into Odia, other languages, but also metaphorically playing this role of simplifying and getting to the crux of what instructions are, because the government instructions tend to come with a whole lot of verbiage, and getting to the crux of it, getting to the point of what are the documents required, what does this do, what decisions can be taken on this basis, is something that we were all learning. And that is a place where we were able to create a very flat structure. It was completely non-hierarchical. It was a very flat partnership between our team and NGOs and civil society organizations that were out there getting the information all the way to the last mile. We even had the community leaders and the POC within every slum, within every urban slum, which was able to translate this. And that, I think, that process somehow organically happened, because of the urgency of it, but also B, because everybody was committed to making it happen. Every component along the way, every link in the chain was very committed to making it happen. And therefore, there was communication happening every day, either online or on social media or on WhatsApp or on the phone. We were communicating and saying, okay, this problem has come up. This is what I need. And we would immediately grab the next available person. So that was an organic process that happened suddenly. And we were lucky that we were able to set it up in a short time. But how we need to, I think now we need to think about how we can sustain such a process and build it into the ways in which governments function. And you also talked in your opening remarks about how civil society groups and non-profits and citizens can partner with the government. And I think this definitely is one of the first areas where such a partnership is not only possible, but also greatly required.
Right. And just to come in on one point there. So from last year's experience, after the initial, issues and stumbling blocks, I think during the execution, especially once you started getting into the relief material distribution and so on, there was some amount of, collaboration and, synchronization. But I would still say one thing that uh, many of us who were volunteering really felt on the ground was this lack of leadership. To have all said and done, to have volunteers or even officials to go tell people on the ground who are like suffering, to say this is what this COVID is all about, this is what you need to do, this is now, if you want to move, go back home, this is what you need to do, how you apply on the system or go to the local police station, etc. That was one thing. But to have especially elected reps, senior people, or people who recognize as leaders to come and talk, that I think was missing on the ground. We did not see much of, whether it was local corporators or MLAs, the amount that could have been done, I think that in my opinion would have made a huge difference. Srini, do you want to comment on that and add to this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Meera. Thanks, BIC, for organizing this and inviting me. It's a privilege, Mr. Ramchandran, to read your book. I always learn a lot from reading books by officers such as yourself. So much learning in there embedded. I highly recommend it to everyone listening in today to read this book, written in a very simple manner and very practical realities of the situation. So quite enlightening, to say the least. And doesn't get it too prescriptive, but still contains wisdoms that action oriented. I'm an eternal optimist, and I think the COVID has made me even bigger optimist in terms of partnership between governments and citizens. Maybe it's not something that government wanted to do, but they had no other choice. Maybe that's the reason why it went like that last year, because however big our government is, it's not big enough to reach every ward of Bengaluru or every area of Bengaluru. That's a fundamental reason why I think citizens and CSOs and NGOs played a key role. And it is like Uma ma'am was recounting that it is just a flat structure, as in there was no hesitation in putting out questions and wondering if, can I ask this? Will somebody be offended? Will I be thrown in jail if I criticize something? No such thing, right? People were talking in very, forthcoming way. And the officers such as Uma ma'am and Atik sir, many others, BBMP commissioner, they were all very forthcoming in how these things, people can work together. Sometimes the crises are good opportunities to bring out the best in people, and perhaps that's what has happened. And the decision making happening at a lower levels always helps clarity, because somebody says something at a very high level, and then if you recall, in the initial days of pandemic, we used to get the red districts and the yellow districts and the green districts based on the number of COVID cases. After a while, I remember very clearly one day in around May or June of last year, the Karnataka government wrote officially, the Chief Secretary of Karnataka wrote to the union government saying, can you please stop labeling our districts? We know how to label our districts, because whatever you are doing is not accurately representing it, and it's causing all kinds of issues. Long story short, the green, red, and yellow went from union central level declaration to state to the district to the city. Ultimately, it became wards. And also, figuratively speaking and really speaking, in apartment buildings in Bengaluru, first one case of COVID, they would seal the entire complex, then that floor, then one floor above it, below it, and then three floors above it. All this tells me that if you decentralize and empower decision making at a local level, there's going to be better execution and trust building that happens between them. I think social media has a very big role in bridging the gap between the people in the government and the citizens on the ground. If you look at the number of informational posters, videos, things are produced by the Government of India, Government of Karnataka, the Municipal Corporation of Bengaluru, it far exceeds any number of advertisements produced by the commercial players and so on. because the governments have the best public interest in mind, and they have found a way of expressing the public service announcements in a language that people will understand, instead of this long boring text that nobody knows what it means. Now they are creating posters, they're putting citizen activists and commercial ad makers to shame by creating really crisp and powerful messaging coming from different government sources. I think they've come a long way, and it's going to go where. Last point I want to add this is, there is no trust deficit I see between citizens and public officials. The trust deficit I see is between citizens and the elected, political executive. The political executive, because of the nature of our elections, the nature of who becomes what, who becomes gets to be a minister, and even now, as of last week, there is all kinds of media news about how two different ministers are of different opinions whether to impose certain restrictions or not, whether a film theater can have 100% occupancy or not. All of these things are happening at that level, and I don't believe that is happening at the officers or a bureaucratic level. Because of that, there has been a lot of issues there. I think one thing that we should really work towards is that when somebody gets elected, whichever party he or she might be, he or she ceases to be a party politician and now a political executive. And if they understand what that means and how to behave and work shoulder to shoulder with other elected representatives and officers, without regard to the affiliation and ideology and things like that, will go a long way. The many of the Bengaluru city MLAs were highly skeptical of making the Bengaluru city councillors in charge of the ration distribution and many things like that. I was really surprised by this, because councillors actually know street by street, area by area, and so on. But the one level above, the state level legislators felt that that's not a good way of doing things, and that's just not the right thing to do. Whatever you might have think about the individuals, you need to work together. So if there is any trust deficit, that's in that political executive class, and I think that needs to happen. And most citizens follow rules. It's a misnomer that citizens don't follow rules. You go to any traffic signal anywhere in India, 99.9% of people follow rules. It's a 0.01% that break the rules, and that applies to everything, not just traffic rules. But because we tend to look at that one guy that's zipping through the red signal, we think that everybody's breaking rules. It's not true. And that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Srini. But I mean, to just comment on one of the points you raised about political compulsions. In fact, there's one question from the audience about, what is happening now. Do you have like religious and political gatherings that are going on? In parallel, you also have that the government's postponing and or canceling examinations, right? Now, this paradox, I think it's hard to kind of get into, talking about the political aspect of things, because we don't have a representative from that section. So I think it's not fair. But leaving that apart, I want to bring this question of dealing with bureaucracy, which is this whole issue, is it about, it's a problem of people, or is it about the processes? Because Mr. Ramchandran, you talked about like fixing some of these issues through monitoring, and you can have surprise check and grievance redressals and so on. Now, while those mechanisms are required, but fundamentally, is it the process which has been defined like, over the years in a very bureaucratic sense, right? And as we become, as we evolve, and there is digital and other options to make this smoother, simpler, and minimal, right? We're talking about maximum governance and minimum government, but we really haven't looked through this designing of processes itself. So can you comment on that?
Is it to me, Meera?
Yeah, please, sir.
See, I would say both. See, it depends on the individual mindset. There will be some who would even interpret what is provided in a liberal manner, in a manner it helps the person concerned. But such people may land in trouble at some stage. And so there is the other group who go strictly by what is laid down and will make life difficult. So it's a difficult choice. That's why I said, left to the government system alone, government functionaries alone, I don't think the expected changes will really happen because I may be a liberal person, the next person may not be that liberal. He would be strict about very many things, thinking about various problems. We, in our service, we keep talking about the secretary who was in the coal ministry who is doing the rounds of courts now. And generally he has a very good reputation. But because that is what happened as far as decision making is concerned. I remember an officer, senior officer from Karnataka cadre years back. He was hauled up for contempt also, if I remember correct. So there are situations like this. So what happens to the civil service is they become cautious and careful. In the process, who suffers? The legitimate person suffers. The crooks may get away with that. They may get away with what they want to get done, and they'll be happy about that. So it's very difficult to draw the line. That's where I say, I agree with Srinivas. I've often thought of this, and though it is at the cost of repetition, I worked in a hill state. See, the amount earmarked for building a primary school building under the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was the same for the entire country. Now, in a hilly place, you get your material out of a truck or whatever it is, and then you have to cart it to take it to some 3 kilometers away or so on pony back or human back or something like that. There is no provision for that. So how does one find the money required for that? So you collect some money and get it transported because the targets have to be met. Now, if the state makes a suggestion to bring about changes, that will go to the central ministry concerned, that will do the rounds. One doesn't know when the solution will come. Of course, the counter to that would be when any new scheme is drawn up, there is a process of generally a process of consultation with all the states. Now, for some it may be difficult to anticipate what are the types of problems, but the very process of consultation means you bring about the required adjustments, changes. Then what I would say is, while it is getting implemented, there should be certain authority available, as I said, at the district or state level or so, where some of these adjustments required relating to local requirements can be made, and that would be taken otherwise. So it's very difficult to explain this, but unless it is built in the process, that real change will not come about, because even if it is digitized and all that, we may lay it down. But as Srinivas rightly said, it's a question of reading and understanding. People like us may understand it in a particular way, but an ordinary person who is just school pass or so, he or she may understand it in a different way. So then you need to depend on someone else to explain it. That explanation leads to some rent seeking and things like that. How to get rid of that? So it's a difficult line to draw, because as I said, if you go to the extreme, then you could be hauled up also, and there are people sitting in the system also, including the political executive colleagues and things like that. So the question is, what I would suggest is, when guidelines are drawn up, they should be tested on the ground, and what are the changes required? Feedback should come to the system, and that should immediately be taken up, and that should get approved. But the process of approval, like, the scheme details are generally approved by the cabinet. So can anyone below the cabinet make a change in the scheme of things? That is the problem. Even a minister may not dare to do that. So we have to look at the procedures also. And when someone certifies that this change has been brought about because of this and this is required, though it could be questioned and it could be challenged also, because we have all sorts of people in the society. So it's a difficult process, but some different type of approaching these problems have to come about, and that has to come about from proactive officers who really want to help people whose integrity is not questionable, whose commitment to do that is not questionable. If such people make it, I think it should be possible to make some changes. Just to extend to one more point, if you recall, on the urban side, when the earlier urban renewal mission was there, all projects used to go to Delhi for approval. Based on the lessons learned from that, it was decided that in the Amrut and all that, Smart Cities mission also, I think current schemes, it was decided that there will be an annual approval for what is to be done, and the rest of the details will be approved at the state level. That is one change which has come about. So there is learning. So similarly, when schemes are drawn up, when guidelines are given, I think there is always scope for giving a feedback and bringing about the correction that the system has to do.
But the challenge I would say is when you have something which is very people dependent and you're expecting like some really good, upright, honest officers to be the change makers, it's not a very scalable solutions, right? In pockets you will see change, but then moment that particular officer is transferred or that functionary is transferred, and things go back to how they were. So how do you where do you start this fixing the system? Because you can't just say expecting like people to be do the right thing, because it has to be independent of people. The system design has to be thought of that way, because in fact you also see, for example, even when we have some process like you're supposed to upload all the details on the website, you see people trying to game the system, right? There are many sites where something like even RTI 41B is like missing, or there is dummy data. If you look at the Karnataka, some of the tender details, there'll be like a 00 nil or something because they're not entered the detail. So what is the point when you have these kind of loopholes? Which is why I'm saying like stressing on the process. So Uma, do you want to come in and share your experience there?
Yeah, thanks, Mira. It's a very good question, and I think it goes to the heart of what governance is all about. Good governance is all about, and I'll continue from what Mr. Ramchandran was talking about. That we need better processes. Processes can often be very cumbersome. They can be opaque. They can be arbitrary, and if you get into the details and based on an ethnographic observation of the kind of time it takes to get through every stage of a process, they may not even be actually meeting the fundamental objective of what that process is supposed to do. Therefore, policy intervention, policy design is a key element in bringing systemic change. I'll give you an example. When we were working in the Women and Child Development Department, we found a huge problem of child malnutrition. And we said that, this data had just come in showing, this was in 2016, data had just come in showing that there was a big problem of child malnutrition and what should be done. So we looked at what was actually going on the ground. And one of the things, when we discussed with a lot of experts, we discussed with the field officials, we discussed with stakeholders, we found that supplementary nutrition was being provided to mothers as well as children, but for the mothers, for the children aged 3 to 6, they were getting hot meals in the Anganwadi, but for the mothers, take-home rations, dry take-home rations were being given once a month. And there were 4 types of problems with this. One was the problem of pilferage, because they would automatically not even go to the mothers, but there was a chance that they could go somewhere else. The second was the problem of uneven quality. The third was because they were being produced in different ways in different places. The third was the problem that even if the quality was fine and the mother did take it home, it would get shared within the family, which is how families function. But the fourth problem was that even if all the other 3 criteria were met, the amount of the take-home ration was not enough to achieve the goal of protecting the mother's nutrition during the 9 months of pregnancy. And therefore, what could be a process intervention, a change? One of the things we looked at was what other states were doing. And we found that Andhra and Telangana had brought in a fundamental change, re-engineering the process to bring, instead of the food going to the mothers as dry rations, the pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers were coming to the Anganwadi every day to have a hot cooked meal. A. B, the amount provided for the meal was tripled, so that a proper, from 7 rupees, it was made 21 rupees, the remaining 14 rupees coming from state resources, so that a proper nutritionally diverse, protein-rich meal, which contained milk and eggs and rice and dal, as well as green leafy vegetables and a little bit of dessert, was provided to the mothers. Thereafter, it was also layered with health interventions like the IFA tablet, the calcium tablet, and so on and so forth. This was not done automatically, even though there was proof of concept. I mean, it's obvious, right? If mothers get to eat, they will have better nutrition and their babies will be better provided for. but we needed to understand operational difficulties. So like Mr. Ramchandran said, we did a very quick pilot, and we did the pilot in 4 different places because Karnataka is a very diverse state, and what works in a tribal area may not work in North Karnataka or vice versa. And straight after the pilot, we did a quick and dirty assessment. We did not take 3 years to do an assessment or an evaluation. We did a quick and dirty assessment based on discussions, based on focus group discussions, visits, and instinct and a hunch. And then we rolled it to scale. We discussed with every level of stakeholders, including Anganwadi workers, Anganwadi helpers, what kind of dimensions the process would take. We built flexibility into the program, another thing that Mr. Ramchandran was talking about. So even in the state program, we gave flexibility to districts, but we also built a concern for detail. We realized that Anganwadi workers would now have to cook twice as much, and therefore instead of a single burner gas stove, we gave double burner gas stoves with an additional pressure cooker. So this is the kind of nimbleness that policy design requires. It requires you to move between the big picture, the granular detail, build in an amount of flexibility so that there can be some ownership as well as some involvement by different regions, but also take a pilot, consult with everybody that you have to, consult with people that you trust, buy their trust, and then quickly assess whether it's going well, see if the operational issues are sorted, and then roll it to scale. Because if we're not doing these consultations at the time of designing a policy intervention, then we're coming up with something that can be quite shoddy and may not meet our goals. It may meet unstated goals, which are not definitely our intention. The other point I want to make is that decentralization is something that we haven't thought about. We often think of processes and we think of the bureaucracy and we think of technology as a way of reaching welfare services to the people. But we don't think of decentralization, which was brought in by the 73rd Amendment, to do precisely this. The principle of subsidiarity, which shows us that if something can be done at the lowest, nearest level to people, then that's where you ought to be doing it. That's where you ought to be planning it and doing it. Decentralization is the other way. And that was where I should add to what Srinivas was talking about. During the COVID response, we found that a decentralized response in panchayats, by creating panchayat task forces, back in March 2020, enabled us to create a platform where panchayats could actually take convergent action. I mean, it's a truism and it's a cliche to say that government departments work in silos. Of course they work in silos because that's how they're designed to work. You can't have huge, vast bureaucratic systems working convergently together at the state level. But if convergence is at all possible, then it's possible on the ground, at the grassroots, at the front lines. And there were panchayat leaders, these were elected representatives, were going house to house with panchayat staff and ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers, doing the house-to-house survey, trying to understand who had come back, who was in isolation, who needed help, who was vulnerable, who was hungry, who needed relief. That was a time when we saw decentralization in action. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks. And that example is very interesting. And I want to bring this question from somebody in the audience, Lakshmi Krishnamurthy, about, is there a difference in attitude between male and female government servants? Because the specific example that you talk about, having double burner stove, instead of single one, for the Anganwadi workers to prepare food faster. So there's a certain difference in perspective. And also she's asked another question about you being a writer and your interest in human relationships and interaction. Has that kind of made a difference as an individual when you are executing the work?
So I'll answer the first question first. I think that men and women respond to issues differently, but that need not necessarily be because of because of gender. It may be, however, I don't think for professional officers, I don't think it makes a difference whether a male officer or a female officer is addressing a particular issue. This particular issue of the double burner stove was noticed by our former Chief Secretary, Mr. Vijay Bhaskar, who was then the Development Commissioner, and we had gone on a field visit. So we had noticed at the same time during the same field visit that this is something that we needed to do. So I think it's just a level of your involvement and your understanding of the issue. Regarding whether reading a lot of literature and reading fiction helps me in my work, it helps me in my work because I can't really blur the boundaries between the reading that I do and the work that I do of dealing with people. But I think everybody has their own ways of getting their sources of motivation and their sources of understanding of how people behave and how people respond to programs and to policies on the ground. So I wouldn't generalize based on that.
Thanks. And before I move to Srini, I just had like one related question about the way mid and junior level functionaries find the system. As is it, are they empowered enough to do their best? Or more often they see this as a thankless job, and that's one of the touch points with the public, right? One of the reasons that an average person goes to a government department and finds it very hard to have close a deal or get the work done is because of this reactions, right? So is the challenge more at that level, empowering of the larger
Yes, definitely.
resources?
Definitely. I think that's a brilliant question. I think we talked about the trust deficit, and we talked about how maybe for us too, it's a necessary thing. This learning to trust, learning to delegate is one thing, but I think learning to trust is also a very fundamental and important part of leadership. Learning to delegate, learning to trust, and then learning to empower. I think frontline and mid-level, street-level bureaucrats need to be empowered far more than they are. Empowering them also comes from understanding the difficulties of their working conditions. And I think there we have some way to go. We need to keep working at it. We are, to be fair, we are an undergoverned country, and there are multiple priorities always before us. But this is, I think, a very fundamental and important part of leadership, leading departments or leading a sector, is to empower grassroots and frontline functionaries and to solve their day-to-day problems, which can help them to function better at the level where they need to function. That's certainly something where we need to do a lot more work.
And what about acknowledging the pressure of the political economy? At the end of the day, the officials are also sort of cogs in the wheel. And I'd like, Mr. Ramchandran, with your experience and what have you observed, and we can complain all that we want, whether it is corruption or lack of ethics or the way people do the work and so on. But again, coming back to the systems issue, is this a key problem that you see, this political pressures and being part of this whole political economy?
Is it to me, Meera?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now that's also a difficult area. I started by saying the distinction between the political executive and the administrative executive. Today we have systems where I'm sure Srinivas will have any number of instances to narrate, where the political executive wants to play the role of the administrative executive. Now that line is not really drawn. And in the book, I have given just one example. See, every minister, when he or she assumes office, is supposed to give a decision on what are the levels of decision making as far as his department or ministry is concerned. And quite often what happens is the minister says that most of the items should be put up to him for final approval. So I have this to say, people think that what are these senior service officers doing? They're not helping anyone. They can help only to a certain extent, in the sense that if the minister insists that most of the file should go to him for a final decision, and it is up to him, he can keep it for 1 day or 10 days or 1 month or whatever it is, then there is a problem. I don't know whether right to information has really reached to ministers' decision-making, files pending in the ministers' offices. I'm not sure about that. So that is one way of looking at things. That's why in my book, I've talked about accountability and this point which you're referring to. I don't think the political executive should be so concerned about whether a birth certificate is to be issued or not. He or she should be concerned about what is the methodology to be adopted, what is the procedure to be followed, and how best it can be delivered. Once that is done, once it is laid down, it is for that empowered executive. And I've listed this. There is a need for clarity as to who can do what. That should be known to the public, and there should be more delegation of such authority to levels much below than what is happening today. That would be a requirement if the system improvement has to come about. All of us would have traveled abroad and found that there are various decisions which someone sitting across the counter takes and conveys to you on the spot at that time itself. So it is possible. So it's both delegation, accountability, and when I take a decision, I would be accountable for that, and it should be in the public domain that this decision has been taken, and it could be reviewed by seniors as far as the process is concerned. So that distinction really has not come about, but still, luckily, I don't think the birth certificate issue goes to a minister or an elected representative. So there are areas where it is delineated and it can be done at the executive level. But the question is, who does that and what are the channels, or are there different levels or layers? That is what is important. So one of the points I'm making is, as I said in the beginning, beyond what has already happened, there has to be an interaction as part of a mission process. There has to be an interaction between the government functionaries and people living in the villages, towns, slums, other remote areas. What are the common instances where you have to interact with government, and what are the problems you find? I think that would complete, I talked about the remaining segment, that would complete work as far as that segment is concerned. Once that is known and the procedure is clarified and it is made known to everyone, including the political executive, so that even if someone approaches the political executive, of course, he contributes to the process of monitoring and changes to be brought about at the policy level. He should come to know about it. There is no doubt about that. But once he knows that, if someone approaches, he should be able to tell that this is the level where you are bound to get it, you will get it. So that type of a clarity has to come about. As Uma rightly says, that we still haven't, unfortunately, matured to that level where trust within the system is there, delegation within the system is there, and clarity as to who decides what is still not there. And that is something which is lacking. And I think that has to be part of this process if we have to overcome this process. Otherwise, as rightly mentioned, we can say that this has been referred to the boss above, and only when it comes back, I can say something. We cannot live with those situations any longer.
Thank you. So I think that kind of covers the service delivery aspect. So moving to this sort of more development focused initiative, Srini, do you want to come in with your experience in terms of what it takes to actually partner with the government? Like, and you've worn multiple hats, working with the government to get something done, as well as, being on the, in campaigns to oppose a particular policy or a decision also. So from that experience, what do you see?
I think the word you are looking for is protest, right? From protest to
collaboration. Yeah.
Right. So I think protest is very important in democracy, and it's a very good part of our system, and it's something that I highly recommend to everybody. And as long as you do not break the rules and do it in a democratic way. Now, you are right in the sense that I moved in this spectrum of work that I've done in the last 10, 12 years, having started trying to change the politics with a new political party, incidentally started by another civil servant, probably a peer of Mr. Ramchandran and Uma Madhavan, Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan in Hyderabad. Worked with him for several years before I put on the activist hat, so to speak, and worked on various things, specifically focused on public transport in Bengaluru, as well as ward committees, which eventually led me to realize that bringing the change in the society can happen when you can increase the citizen participation in grassroots democracy. So that's what led me to leave my software career and jump into Janagraha, which has been working for 20 years, exactly trying to do that. empowering the city governments, increasing the citizen participation in governance and decision making. And in this last year alone, if any of you who are from Bengaluru have been following the Bengaluru budgets, the BBMP budget, this year budget will come as a mild shock to you, because the budget opens with the statement that we would like citizens to take over governance of the parks in the city. We would like citizens to take 20 lakhs from us, and in the ward committees maintain their own footpaths with this money. We would like 1% of the property tax collected in the ward to go back to the ward committee so they can use it for whatever they think is important for them. These are all the things that are said in the BBMP official budget this year. Tulsi ma'am, she's a IS officer, finance representing the BBMP, has made this budget speech, and in that budget document you will find many incidents of that devolution to zonal councils. BBMP now has zonal councils where 2,000 crores of BBMP budget is now under the command and control of the zonal councils, and further below that is the ward committees and so on. So for those of us that are clamoring for ward committees and empowerment and citizen participation, many of those fantasies and dreams have come true in this budget. But now the real game begins. Are the citizens ready to do this? Saying this is one thing, but do you really want to do this? Often I find that it's much more convenient for citizens, having straddled both worlds, to complain and criticize, but when the time comes to collaborate and partner, then you won't find many takers. It's a harsh reality because they have their own lives. I'm not blaming anyone here. I'm just stating a matter of fact. Because
Srini,
working with the, yes,
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
am I coming through?
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So what the recent experience with the participatory budget program in BBMP has shown that it's called the My City, My Budget. When the citizens are involved in the process of making budget, they're incented to making sure that the budget is actually executed. So when they come into the picture, what role they play and how the collaboration works and whether the budget reflects the citizen inputs or not, and then creates avenues and institution mechanisms for them to participate, to monitor public spend and actually ensure that whatever is locally needed is done. If you can do that, then suddenly everybody is empowered and everybody is interested in working on that. It cannot be that so many people are complaining and nothing is happening on the other end. We cannot depend on few bright officers like Uma ma'am or somebody else. That's just not going to work. We have a huge gap of staff in municipal governance in India, including BBMP, where there's more than 50% staff vacancies. We don't have ward officers, we don't have engineers per ward. Each ward of Bengaluru is as big as a urban local body of Odisha, which is where I work a lot these days with Janagraha. Phenomenal success of how to strengthen the municipal system, how to build capacities in the municipal system, down the line till the ward officers, solid waste management, property tax, any number of things is happening there. And the problem I feel is that the complications in the governance are kept complicated because people that are running the government don't have time to think about these things. You can think about these things maybe post-retirement and analyze it and work on it, or you can stumble upon it on a visit and try to solve that child malnutrition problem. But on a given day-to-day basis, I don't think our officers, IAS or below or anywhere else, they don't have time to stop, pause, think, okay, what can be done to do better? They're always running. They work very hard. It's unfortunate that the municipal bureaucrats are always, criticized by the public, but they are the most hardworking officers in any government layer, as far as I can see and tell. So we need to somehow make that happen. How do you take a breath and understand, okay, what do we need to do now? Right? And it cannot always be as a response to COVID. It has to be a response to the National Family Health Survey, like ma'am is doing with child malnutrition. There are any number of metrics and data available. Ask them to take a look at it and ask for a public consultation. Very few number of people in public are really interested in these matters of public interest. They are the ones that will participate. They are the ones that will take matters forward.
Exactly. So that brings me to the point. So whatever you have now, in some ways, is a middle class or elite phenomenon, right? How do you enlarge the scope? For example, I think rural areas, you've seen a lot of very good um, um, campaigns and social audits. A lot of work has been done at the ground level, but for some reason in the urban space, it's a much more like limited to the middle class and above, right? How do you actually enlarge scope and get people from, the urban poor, people from the slum communities, migrant workers, actually getting involved in things that matter to them?
Look,
Could I
people
go
are
on
going
this?
to
Oh,
work
sorry,
on
go ahead.
Yes, go ahead,
sorry,
ma'am.
just one point, ma'am. And people are going to do what they can do and they're able to do. It is almost unfair to expect a certain type of people, daily wage earners, to participate in governance, leaving aside their daily wages and their struggle for their existence, and getting their basic necessities, fetching water, and so on. So it is those of us that have the ways and means to organize in a inclusive way. Anyone who thinks of himself or herself as an organizer, as somebody who aggregates public voice, must ask himself or herself, am I actually representing the voice of everyone in the society, or am I being very privileged and thinking in my own way of upbringing and my own surroundings, right? If they start asking that question, then the right things will automatically happen. When we fought against the elevated corridor as part of the citizens movement, 45 organizations of Bengaluru have come together to oppose that particular project. The opposition is not the main issue here, but the building of the coalition is the issue. The coalition was built because those of us at the forefront of the movement have consciously made a decision that we must reach out to this organization, we must reach out to that group, and they need to be put in front of the media. They need to be at the forefront of this agitation. When there is a meeting with the chief minister, they need to sit at the table. And when this happens together in a very proactive way, then you are representing everyone's voice. It's not true that only few voices are heard. It is just that's how it appears, and a lot of this is because of the media. The media knows who to call when there is an issue. They often call me when there is some civic issue or something else. What's your reaction? And I often tell them I'm not the right person to react to this. But why are they calling me? Because they don't have time to reach out to somebody and then get there, go into the field and do that familiarity. So they want to quickly get something out. But if media starts doing that, then more voices will come out. And there is tremendous leadership in the urban slums and the economically backward classes. It may not be visible because the mainstream media doesn't give them visibility, but there is excellent leadership, and there's actually much better collaboration in these communities with the political class and the bureaucratic class than the middle class and the upper middle class, who don't know where the water is coming from. As long as the water flows from the tap, they don't care if it's coming from the water supply board or a tanker that is stealing water from the next street itself.
Thanks, Srini. Uma, ma'am, you wanted to add?
Yeah, Srinivas, thanks for giving that context. I just wanted to add to whatever you said, that certainly it's important for groups to be inclusive, and those who are in these forums ought to be mindful that they are representing others who may not be present in these forums. But I also think it's possible for us to work on creating associations where there can be a gender lens and a social equity lens, and also, for example, a disability lens. It's important to bring in perspectives of persons with disabilities, bring in perspectives of others who may be left out, of senior citizens, perspectives of single women, elderly single women, things like that. And therefore, I think creating these associations, creating these representative associations also requires holding the meetings at a time and a venue which is convenient to all, especially those. And being mindful again that for somebody who is less privileged, who is not privileged, it may require, it may impact their livelihood, and therefore consult with them and hold the meeting or hold the consultation at a time that is convenient to them. Because I think richness and texture of voices is very important in order to make these associations more meaningful and to bring in the voices of those who initially, definitely those who can represent, organizers and so on who can represent, but also more and more trying to bring in those who have hitherto not been able to have a voice is very, very important. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty critical. And in fact, I wanted to also highlight there is a current criticism. There is less of a commitment to, engagement and public hearings from the government, especially the bureaucracy, for whatever reason, whether it is lack of time, bandwidth, capacity, or even political pressure, or those the specific decision needed to be pushed in a certain direction. So there may be multiple reasons, but in general, there's in the last few years you kind of see this criticism that it's there's much less importance given to public hearing and so on, because I think that kind of covers a question one from the audience, which talks about like how do you really reach out to the last mile for the last person, whether they're migrant, traffic, bonded labor, or child laborers. How do you really reach them? And I think your question answered that. It is that onus is on the government to reach out to the to the last person that way. Thank you.
I would
Uh,
also just like to
yeah.
respond to that. That I have started. I have a thing about this last mile concept, where it's again a very top-down metaphor that we are bringing something from the top and taking it all the way to the last mile. But when we actually talk of decentralization, we should flip the metaphor and we should talk about the first mile, the people who are underserved or who are unserved and who are hitherto excluded. Even technology has a very centralizing tendency, and technology can help us to very usefully to look at inclusion errors. But exclusion errors are something that you can only address by decentralizing services, and again bringing in the voices of those who are completely marginalized, the bonded laborers or the manual scavengers or the child laborers or those who have hitherto not had a voice. And again, to respond to that, even in the Panchayat Raj Act, precisely for this reason, there is a concept of having a Mahila Gram Sabha or a Makkala Gram Sabha, Children's Gram Sabha, where the attempts are made. I wouldn't say that this is a perfect thing. These are all flawed, and they need to be worked on more and more to make them, to perfect them and to improve them every year. But those are forums where the voices of children and the right of children to participate also can be made possible. And institutional design, both in rural and urban governance, is very important to make these kind of platforms available and possible at a systemic level, rather than to depend on the whims of people. Consultations and platforms for engagement, associations of diverse voices, those are what build democracy in day-to-day governance. And that's extremely important, I think.
Right. And to just take the same case in an urban context, democracy and autonomy and strengthening of the local institutions is very critical, right? And citizens can and will engage at a community level, at a neighborhood or a ward level, but it's not so easy to scale that involvement at a state or national level, right? So the decentralization you talked about earlier, 74th and 73rd amendments, are very critical, but somehow that commitment, whether it is by the state and the center to they're not comfortable in devolving powers to the third tier, or for whatever reason, that's, I think, a huge stumbling block. Would you say, Mr. Ramchandran, do you want to come in and say how local institutions can be fixed? Because otherwise this whole engagement becomes very theoretical.
There are 2 points involved here. One is the political part of it, the elected part of it, if I may put it in a better way. I think people need to be trained as far as becoming public representatives is concerned. Srinivas somewhat referred to that also. There is no denying the fact that after the 2 constitutional amendments, probably villages are much, much more better off, not the urban areas, the local bodies. And I have come to the conclusion after practicing this and talking about it and studying and making attempts and all that, it cannot be easily done unless the top political executive wants it. And I always cite this example. Penelosa was a mayor in one of the Latin American countries. He did so well, he straight away became candidate to become the president of that country.
Right.
So that probably clarifies what I'm trying to say. But that does not mean when we try to have area sabhas introduced under the reform agenda of the Urban Renewal Mission, probably at that time, Andhra Pradesh legislated for that. One or two other states made some half-hearted efforts to have area sabhas. I was comparing, if we had area sabhas functional when this pandemic was there or still there, how much of a difference it would have made. The points referred to by Uma, the types of people, I mean, area sabha could have a representation like that. Even those maids who come and work, there could be a representation for them. The very senior citizens who need help, the professionals, the lady professionals who work, it could be a combination of such people, and they could make a beginning, and probably they could get trained as to how to run the system at that level. First, it will be data collection and preparing for the area as such, but slowly, steadily, it could get upscale. So only when we have these three levels below the local body, the municipal council or corporation, ward level more functional. Every state does not have functional ward committees. I'm glad to hear that in Bengaluru it is working to some extent. And then the area level, it is important. Area level means the polling booth level. These levels are important, so people should get trained as to how to manage this, and probably that is the only opportunity they will get to know as to how difficult the balancing act is. It's not that there is funds for everything. Like the parks management he mentioned, someone would want X park to be maintained, someone would want Y park to be maintained in this way or that way. So how to balance things have to be learned at that level. And that would in a way come in relevant as far as the governance of delivery of services systems is concerned. I consider it on a slightly different platform, because elected is one. I mean, I don't agree with the proposition that elected means they will do everything, because still the delivery of services would be in the hands of the continuing civil service system, because there has to be a continuing accountability. They may make the policies, they may lay down the guidelines and things like that, but it is at this level which has to happen. And only when we go down, like it has happened in at least in some areas as far as urban local governance is concerned, like birth certificate and things like that, it can be issued by the local body. It is not issued by the state government, luckily. So there are areas like that. And in the urban governance discussions, funds, functions, functionaries, this is a constant point for discussions, debate. That does not happen, and probably state governments do not want it. So I do not know we can there is any point in bringing in that point in our discussion now. We have to be focusing on what can be done. And I think what I'm suggesting is things which can be done, what you and I are entitled to. How do we get that without getting involved in complications?
Right,
That simplification of process and making that happen, that is what is critical.
Right. Actually, from I think Bangalore's perspective, even in Karnataka, there is a huge push, and civil society is actually strongly advocating and lobbying for stronger local institutions. So here, asking for a 5-year term for a mayor, or a stronger BBMP council, more autonomy for the local ward level functionaries and so on. So these are things I think at much more they're bigger part of the public discourse here. So in that way, I think Bangalore is much more perhaps advanced in terms of our civil discourse. So in a way that good, but that point about area sabha is well taken. It definitely would have made a difference last year, I think. There are 2 points which I don't think we have time to go into, but I'll just mention it because these are preconditions for stronger governance as well as better relationship between the multiple stakeholders, which is one is civil society organizations. And I think currently NGOs and CSOs are facing different kinds of pressure. So that is one key thing we need to keep in mind. And the other thing is this whole relationship with media, right? There was a couple of comments about the media also earlier, but in general we have seen you see governments, or at least in some states, distrusting media and bypassing these formal communication channels. And just because there is Twitter or Facebook doesn't mean everything has to go there. There is a certain role for media so that they can question, cross question, and evaluate and add their perspective and connect the dots. And that's sort of not been happening. not just because of what the government is doing, but also media's own problems of viable models, and they have kind of lost their independence, or they don't have the bandwidth and the resources to actually do a full-fledged, a comprehensive job in terms of their journalism. So these two, I think, are important things that we need to acknowledge and figure out how to fix them. So given that we kind of running out of time, I need to move towards the end. Let's talk about now solutions. What is it? And in your books, you've kind of proposed multiple ideas to fix the system. So you, for example, you've talked about this very interesting thing called ease of interaction index. So do you want to just like mention a few of them, and then I would like the other panelists to also come in.
Yeah, I will not be able to say much about the media role. Media has to play its role of highlighting what the problems are. But whether the government is interacting, and when the government is interacting, the civil servant would get away by saying that civil service is supposed to be anonymous. It's another matter that during certain times, civil service becomes a bit more active, and that communication helps also. Probably, as Srinivas was referring to, media also likes it because there is some headline news for tomorrow that this is under consideration, that is under consideration, this note is going for the cabinet and things like that. So that's a way of looking at things. I won't have much to say on that. But as you refer to these two, we have different types of indices, good governance index, the ease of doing business, this, that, and all that. But all of them, the good governance index is limited to certain sectors only. So I have reversed it by saying that the ordinary person should be able to contribute to the process of making an assessment as to whether X department has functioned all right, service delivery is fine. So that feedback, it may be called citizen feedback, but more than citizen, because about citizen feedback also there are issues. People say that government functionaries can fix the type of feedback which comes. So we have to have an independent method of citizen feedback coming, not from the point of view of blaming somebody, but from the point of view of whether performance is all right, what are the improvements which need to be brought about. And it should equally be applied to all segments, sections. Once again, to recall my earlier experience, when service level benchmarks were introduced for the urban sector, I had suggested that this is an excellent opportunity for the mayor. Every year when the budget is presented, the mayor could tell the people that as far as SLBs are concerned, this is where my city stands and this is the improvement I'll bring about. And I always quote this instance, the water utility which was privatized in London. They every year talked about, they reported to the public 99.5% efficiency, the balance 0.5% efficiency. This is how we plan to improve, and we won't impose the burden on the people. So there are instances like that. We talk about best practices. I've referred to that also. Best practices should be shared, and people down below should be authorized to go in for such practices if they are found worthwhile for the people there, and it could be taken up. So a change in the good governance index pattern, and two ways of looking at it. The citizen feedback as to how the service delivery of a particular department or system has been, that should constantly be there. And an index of how easy it is for people to deal with government. That's also another index which should be there. These two I've talked about, and I think if these are also taken up actively, and my faith is on something like the Swachh Bharat mission. It has to be a mission. We have to target for something to be achieved by 2022. And as I said in the beginning, many things have been done, but the remaining what needs to be done. I'll also refer to one more example. The Meghalaya Chief Secretary said at some stage, I think in 2019 in an e-governance conference, how do I take this digital process to the entire state, because I do not have internet connectivity in the entire state. In remote parts of the state, I do not have connectivity. So it is one thing to talk about, all these things happening and it is hassle-free and all that, but whether it is actually happening at the ground level, that is the feedback we have to get, and that is the change which we have to bring about by being conscious of that, and again, not in the form of finding fault with state also. And I also has given a suggestion that the state performance should be evaluated every year. As far as delivery of services to people is concerned, there could be a very, very detailed system, and state's performance should be evaluated, and that should also become available to the people.
Thank you. There is this one question about privatization of some of the services, like like the way passports and all have been done. I wouldn't take this question, one, for lack of time. Plus, it's a very huge debate, and there are pros and cons and multiple aspects that we won't be able to cover today. But let me just move on to Uma ma'am and Srini. Like, if you could talk about the way forward, what are the different kind of interventions, policy changes, systemic changes that we could consider to improve this relationship?
Yeah, thanks, Meera. As I've already talked about decentralization, but there's a statistic I wanted to share, some research. In 1993, we had the 73rd Amendment, and in the end of that decade, somewhere in 1998, there was a research study conducted by an academic in Rajasthan, which showed that about 18% of people went to the panchayat as the first port of call for social welfare services. But by the year 2010, somebody else had gone and done a study, a similar study in Rajasthan Panchayats, and this number, this percentage had increased to 68%, which shows that the Panchayat is already an important port of call. This is in Rajasthan. And in southern states like Karnataka, this would be far more. So decentralized. The second thing is, I think that adding to what Mr. Ramchandran was saying, this kind of ease of interaction with government should be assessed not only by looking at our processes and talking to field functionaries, but also looking at those who are invisible to policy. Who are those who have been excluded, and asking them exactly why they have been excluded. For example, why has a migrant worker been excluded from a ration card, right? Then we would understand a whole set of problems. Why has a child with a disability not got a disability maintenance allowance? We talk to the mother, we'll understand a whole set of problems. Why has a disabled person not been able to give their application for a particular service or a particular job or a house at the panchayat? Maybe the panchayat is physically not made accessible at all. So we need to understand obstacles. If we need to talk to those, look for those who have been invisible, who have been excluded, who have been invisible to our policies, and go out there and find them and understand what are the obstacles. Who are the girls who are getting married before the age of 15 or 16 or 17? Why are they getting married? Why do we should talk to their parents, and we should talk to them and understand what are the obstacles in helping them to access education. So this is one thing. I would say that we certainly hassle-free governance, but we broaden the definition of what is a hassle. Getting a passport in a day or 2 days or 3 days is a hassle. Getting a driver's license in 3 days or 5 days is a hassle. Paying some money at the sub-registrars is a hassle. But so also, if only 92% of births, live births, are getting registered, and if only 92% of babies being born in a year are getting birth certificates, that's 8% of babies without a birth certificate. So that's something we need to solve. Who are the people who are not getting death certificates? Can we bring marriage certificates closer to people, make it easier for people to get marriage certificates? Will that help to solve problems of abandonment, help women to be more empowered, solve the problem to some extent of child marriage? So these are questions we need to be asking. We need to look out for those who are invisible to policy. We also need to delve into the questions of why they are invisible and how we can reach them. And many of these, of course, require going to the last mile, but some of these also require starting from that and making it the first mile.
Yeah, over to Srini.
Thanks. That last part was really something that everyone should pay serious attention to. We keep talking about various urban issues, this and that, passports and licenses and so on and so forth. But it's important to have perspective. And when you're battling things like child malnutrition and child marriage and so many other social evil, discrimination, all these urban, so-called urban issues, service delivery issues pale in comparison to that. So any one of us who are interested in matters must have that perspective first and foremost. Not that these things are not important, but they're far less important in my personal opinion. Bringing back to the subject of today's conversation is about bringing government and people closer, right? I think the question I want to ask and the solution I want to propose is that define government. What do you mean bringing government and people closer? Which government are you talking about? Are you talking about prime minister? Are you talking about chief minister? Are you talking about the mayor? Or are you talking about the councillor or your ward committee member? I think it's nearly impossible to bring the people closer to the prime minister, other than listening to the speeches and presentations and so on. Almost nearly as impossible to bring closer to the chief minister or the member of parliament or member of legislative assembly. But it is doable, and it must be and can be done, that bringing people closer to the urban governance, the city government. I want to stop. I want all of us, if you agree with me, to stop using the word municipal government, urban local body, municipality, and start using the phrase city government. When we can say central government, state government, why? What is stopping us from saying city government? The word itself carries a certain gravitas and respect and credibility to it, and we by calling it urban local body, local government, local self government, we are defeating the purpose of the third tier of governance. The reason the constitutional amendments of 73rd and 74th, and especially 74th, hasn't taken root as much as say 73rd, is that there isn't a clarity on what exactly the powers and funds and functions of are given to the urban bodies are, and they've left in a gray area, and each state interpreted it in the way that they want. And the problem itself comes from it being a central law. I think the time has come for us, and I'm making a rather unconventional statement here. We need to stop talking about 74th Amendment and start talking about Karnataka Municipality Act, Tamil Nadu Municipality Act, Assam Municipality Act. Let's look at those. Let's work on those. Let's bring the people and the municipal government together. And even if you pass a national level legislation, today in our situation, we can see that many state governments immediately come back and say, pass a resolution even in the state legislature saying our state will not implement that central law. And that is the current political equation that we have. So having taken cognizance of all of this, and also considering the theory of subsidiarity that Uma ma'am has pointed out very early on, and this is a very difficult concept for people to understand. For the average citizen, he's stuck in front of the traffic pothole in half an hour, he hasn't moved. The urge is to tweet Narendra Modi, not anything else. And if you ask them, who's your counselor? What do you mean, which counselor? Who's your MLA? I don't know. Who's your MP? MP they might know, but they don't know anything beyond that. So we need to bring people closer to the city government. That's my point. And when we do that, it eventually leads to people being close to government itself, whether it is state or central government. But instead of trying to abstract this out, make it very real, and bringing people and city government together is the job of the ward committee. And guess what? The ward committee is already in the law. All we need to do is make it happen. Look at the panchayats in Karnataka. Every single thing happens through the Gram Sabhas. If you follow the Twitter handles of the RDPR, you will be overjoyed with the amount of the public participation in governance in the panchayat level. I'm waiting to see that day in all the city municipal corporations of Karnataka and municipalities and all that. And we are doing whatever we can from Janagraha's perspective, and also many active citizens, but a lot more citizens need to participate in this. We need to stop complaining and start collaborating. And you collaborate with your councillor, you collaborate with your municipal commissioner, your ward officer, ward engineer. These are the people that are going to make your life easy or worse on any given day. So then why bother working with the CM and the PM and the cabinet and all that? Leave them alone. Let them do whatever they're trying to do to take the country and the state forward. You work with your local government system, the city government system, make your own neighborhood better. Then you have a proof point. You can say that if I participated, this got better. So now you are the walking, talking role model of change and participation and being close to the government. So that is going to inspire those around you. And I think this is the only way we can strengthen our democracy from the grassroots level.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Srini. I think we're out of time. So if I could just summarize, Mr. Ramchandran in his book has elaborated a lot of points in what constitutes good governance, right? He's elaborated a model for good governance, which is talking about how to right from identification of the most important issues, understanding agendas, ensuring oversight, and having these kind of mechanisms like ease of interaction, indices, digitalization, assessments, and report cards. So there's a lot of things he's talked about, and I urge everybody to go read the book. And today, a lot of really important points came out. We talked about first, and I like Srini's point about acknowledging and using the word government for any, the officialdom that we talk about, whether it's a local body or a municipal council, it is the government. So that is very important. And understanding that decentralization is core to having better interaction and more personal engagement. That's a very valid point. And that's how you kind of go from like just a service delivery model into a collaborative and a partnership mode. We also talked about empowering ground level functionaries, and that is something that the government must consider and figure out how to fix. We and Uma made a lot of very critical points about how to move from the big picture to the granular level, and bringing that commitment and a closer look at issues and asking the right questions of why these challenges are there, why are people having problems, and how we can fix them. So I think this has been a most enriching session. Thank you all for participating in this panel. Thank you to the audience for some wonderful question. I hope we were able to answer many of them. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Meera. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Ramchandran, Uma, Srinivas, and Meera for this frankly eye-opening session, which I'm sure has been great learning for all those who have attended, if their experience was anything close to mine. Thank you once again for your time, your expertise, your work, and your passion for your work. And thanks to everyone who joined us, and hope you're leaving teeming with several new ideas and a lot of hope, as I am. Good night, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.